If you can find someone to help you with something, let them do it. Because the more free time you have, the deeper you can think. And ultimately, the PM superpower is empathy. Strategy is it's quite simply defining what the game is that you're trying to win and defining how you will keep score. So I think if you don't have principles already written down for your company, your product, then you shouldn't be trying to manufacture them at the top of your strategy document. You don't want to take a low confidence, low return bet. You want to take a low confidence, extremely exponential return sort of bet. You want to use experiments to answer the hard product questions, right? Which is, do people care about this? And you want to find the cheapest way to get to that experiment. The job of the PM is to make sure there's a culture of product on the team. Right. So my interpretation has been, as a PM, you don't need to make all the decisions. You just need to make sure the best decision gets made. I'm not a big fan of fake it till you make it, which a lot of people say. I'm like, no. Hopefully in a well-functioning environment, you can sort of say what you don't know, and still people will give you the time to do it well.
All right, I'm super excited about today's episode with Satyajeet Salgar. Satyajeet, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to chat.
So if you haven't seen him online yet, Satyajeet is a director of product at Google. He's led PM teams at YouTube Shopping, Google's Discover feed, Google Assistant, Google Ads, and some other products, which we'll get to hear about in just a second. So he's been around product management for quite some time, and that's where we'll start today. What product area do you lead at Google now?
I currently lead a team that works in the applied AI space. So I manage product and UX. We do a bunch of things that are on the edge of product and research. We've launched a ton of things across Google PAs, and right now we're very focused on platforms and devices. So things on device models would do, things with Android, things with Chrome, etc.
Awesome. What's the coolest thing your teams have shipped recently?
So recently that I can talk about, so this is stuff that the teams were working on before I got here, but we launched essentially a speaking practice app. So if you're in India or in many parts of the world where you want to practice English on search, you can now do that with Google in simulated scenarios. And personally, one of the cool ones that sort of was around that time is a feature that we call nowcasting. So if you use Google search to search for the weather, which many people do, you'll often see, highly precise information about precipitation. So things like the rain's going to end at 12:40, which is very convenient if you're planning something. So that's something my team helped launch as well.
Very useful features. So within the applied AI space and AI generally, we've heard a lot of Google launches. I think there was a hilarious meme of Sundar. How many times he said AI in the latest Google I/O? Because you guys are shipping it across so many areas. And I think another famous post that recently went viral was a UX designer who had actually quit Google. And one of the reasons he mentioned was that Google was kind of rushing in and plugging AI into everything. So I'm curious, what is it like on the inside being a part of Google's rush to AI?
I think maybe I'll come in the first part and then the second part, which is I think not just Google. As an industry, I think I've often joked where it feels like sometimes we're in this stage where everyone is like, okay, how can I sprinkle an LLM on the product that I already have? And I think this is, across products, across companies. And I think this is a combination of reasons, right? People feel pressure from their boards, everyone hears about this. But also there's genuine excitement, right? On some level, we have this thing that is intelligence. We have people that are trying to do something. How can we use this intelligence to make their life better? And I think what you're seeing at many places is the first stage of we have this incredibly powerful technology. How can it be used to make our user flows better? And I think that's the stage we're at now. And in some cases, I think in the excitement, people sort of make suboptimal decisions. And I can imagine, I don't know about the specifics of this person who was very upset, but I can imagine in that flow, people sort of, all of that can be sort of disorienting for some people, right? But I think, at least for me, it is that sense of excitement. And I do think in a case of a lot of these cases, you get the second round where you actually get sort of the product that connects everything. I've seen, occasionally teams go like, wait, what you're doing looks very similar to this. This should be like a joint initiative, or these two should connect better. But I think that's hard, especially early on, especially when you're trying to get something out quickly. And so sometimes you just have to be more patient and sort of fix that in a second launch or a combined initiative. And I think that's the way sort of a lot of these things get fixed. And I think once you've been around as long as I have, you realize that, hey, you sort of need to maybe sort of be a little more patient and come back with some of these initiatives. You don't get it right the first time. And I think that's my sense, honestly, across the industry, right? Which is, right now we're still in the phase where we're trying to use this really powerful technology to make our existing products better. And sometimes it's not applied as usefully to people or as thoughtfully as it should be.
Let's talk about one of the biggest untapped opportunities in product management: unstructured data. You've got tons of it: customer calls, emails, surveys, tickets, Slack messages, you name it. We all know that hidden in that chaos are the insights that could define our next product feature. But how do you extract those insights without losing hours sifting through the noise? That's where BuildBetter.ai comes in. Build Better doesn't just organize your data, it transforms it. Imagine every customer call, every internal discussion instantly turned into structured, actionable insights. That's BuildBetter.ai. Ready to transform how your team handles unstructured data? Head over to BuildBetter.ai and see for yourself. Use code Aakash15 for 15% off your first 3 months and get 5 hours of free recording time. That's BuildBetter.ai, because in product management, insights are everything. This episode is brought to you by Interpret. Interpret unifies all your customer interactions, from Gong calls to Zendesk tickets to Twitter threads and App Store reviews, making them available for comprehensive analysis. As we've profiled in the newsletter, it's the trusted choice of product organizations like Canva, Notion, and Descript. They rely on Interpret to drive forward their voice of customer programs. What makes Interpret special is its ability to, 1, build customer-specific AI models that provide more accurate categorization. 2, connect customer feedback directly to revenue impact so you can prioritize confidently. And 3, uncover insights with their Wisdom AI Copilot so you have an intuitive chat interface to access your data. So if you want a custom model built for your organization, get in touch with the team at interpret.com/product growth. That's ENTERPRET.com/product growth. And within Google, how has the AI directive come down? How have you experienced it on the ground? I think you recently moved into an AI team. Has that been kind of like the high level company strategy, and then people have been getting reallocated into these AI investment areas? How has it felt inside Google?
I think there's definitely excitement around the space. So in my personal case, right, I just I often tell people, like, I was sort of AI adjacent for most of my career. So I spent, I would say, the largest time of my career on Google search. I worked on answers, I worked on the knowledge graph, I worked on all sorts of things that are around the space. And you would often, sort of use the technology, but it was not quite there yet, or it worked for a small subset of use cases so that you couldn't scale it. And I think once you sort of saw what was possible, like I'd say the night ChatGPT came out was the most animated email I've ever written to former colleagues. I think there's a sense of incredible excitement, right? Of like, okay, wait, like, all that stuff is possible now. And so for me, it was I knew the thing that I was excited about, I would need to move teams, and I ended up moving to this team. I do think across the company, there is the sense, Sundar, our CEO, is sort of say, like, we've been an AI company for a long time, and this feels like an inflection point was reached a couple of years ago, and I think we feel this energy and urgency to like do something about it. And I think that is cascaded down in terms of like where people spend their time, what people are allocated to, all of that. I think, like, to be clear, there's large parts of the company that still do sort of other things, but I do think there's increasingly urgency and excitement around AI across the company, really.
And as a director, what do the conversations and thinking look like? Are you guys strategizing like we need to think about having more of our overall search product scope shifted into AI initiatives or our overall cloud scope shifted into it?
Yeah.
How are those decisions made?
Um, So I think I think most of Google, sort of as you sort of get to middle and senior management, you're sort of player coach, and so the coach side is definitely making sure everyone feels prepared in their particular bucket. To like, are people getting the right training? Do people understand what needs to happen? Do people sort of have people internalize how to think about it for their area? I think on the strategy itself, absolutely. I think both developing a view on how this will affect the people that you care about, and I think I'm in a more unique position now because I'm in an applied AI team that's doing nothing but that. But even when I talk to other colleagues that are more focused on products, it's very much the sense of, okay, how should we invest now in this technology that will best serve our user needs? And so it's very much allocation for resources, how you plan, all of that gets affected.
It's always interesting to hear the inside of what it's like to be a director of product. And at a big tech company, a lot of people really aspire to that. What does your typical day look like?
Um, there is, I often joke, there is no typical day. I think it is a lot of meetings, which I try and reduce. But I think a lot of it is you sort of budget time between sort of coaching people, sort of solving organizational problems, right? So, not just as a director, even when I became a manager, like the email that I write to people is, hey, it's my job A to help you, and B sort of solve a lot of the organizational things that you need to be solved. You need solved in order to do your job well. Understanding things, understanding strategy, removing roadblocks. So that's part of it. And I think increasingly a part of it is understanding how the world is evolving and technology is evolving and connecting the dots. So I think the way that sort of manifests itself is you read a lot, you talk to a lot of people, you're in meetings doing product reviews, uh, understanding focus group studies, all of that. And so I think it's all of those things. And based on the stage of the project, that changes, right? So if something's going up to launch, you're reviewing marketing comms, you're figuring out go-to-market strategy. So it all varies. And I think as currently I sort of manage a portfolio of different products, sort of you deal with spikes in each of these. So yeah, it's very different based on sort of every day is extremely different.
And zooming in on that jump from manager to director, I
Yeah,
think personally what I experienced was in particular around that organizational unblocking, how
yeah,
important that becomes, and where you really become sort of the glue between yourself and other product leaders and really allowing
yeah.
your team to succeed. Can you talk more about that and what does that look like? What are the types of things you might be doing, the types of problems you might be solving, and how you solve those?
I think a lot of it is building credibility, so they know you're thinking sort of they know you're thinking and sort of with their interests in mind as well as sort of the sense of all of Google, but then also understanding all the players and sort of what their interests are. I often sort of there was this early sort of meme and study at, actually not a meme, a study at Google where they said like some of the PMs that did best were people that were former startup founders. And they said mainly it was because these were people that sort of, understood ambiguity really well. They didn't take, when someone said no to them, they didn't take that as a final answer. They found a way to like convince, cajole, go around. And I think a lot of that is, so part of my job is often, especially when I come in new to an area, is going and introducing myself to people, saying, "Hey, this is me. This is what I do. This is how I can help. Let's talk about what you care about. How can my team help?" And so a lot of that organizational glue, I think, is helps projects succeed. To the extent, a few years ago, someone was recruiting me for a role, and it wasn't a role I ended up taking. This is internally, but I was like, oh, I'm curious, like why do you? And I sort of generally assume, oh, it's because I do product well or I have good product instincts. Is that why someone told you to come talk to me? And this person said, no, we need someone that can just get stuff done across Google and work with other teams. And someone told us, that's something you're good at. Which surprised me as like I was like, wow, that's the skill you're looking for. He's like, yeah, no, that's super important for this role. And so I think there's an element of that, right? Which is how do you get people together? How do you sort of bring everyone along? There's a skill to it, and I think it's sort of genuinely wanting everyone to succeed becomes the quality you bring, right? So I think one of the things that's maybe sort of very different at director versus lower down is you are able to think for the company, not just for your team or for your product, and you act in that way, right? And people see you act in that way consistently. So they trust you and sort of want to go along with you. I think to me that's the big difference.
Yeah, I would plus one that it's almost like trying to be a giver or trying to
Yes.
be putting the organization behind the company, putting the company first, not how many reports you have, but how successful the company is. That's my big takeaway there.
Correct. In the long run, I often tell people this is a long run game, right? So you can be short term oriented and win like a small thing right now, but it's really the long term that matters.
Absolutely, and especially if you're going to have a long tenure like you have had. So now let's soft transition into our core topic of the day, which is strategy. And
All
since
right.
we've been talking so much about Google, I want to first hear about that in a Google context, sort of the end of life strategy decision, which maybe not every product manager has even faced yet in their career if they're only 5, 7 years in. But you've been a part of a lot of these end of life
Mm-hmm.
decisions. I've heard an
Right.
interview recently when you talked about Google Plus Games.
Yep.
More recently, I think people listening probably have heard of Google Optimize, at least amongst my
Mm-hmm.
reader base. That's been a sad one. Or Google Domains before that, both happening at the end of last year. So it continues to happen quite often at Google, and it seems to be a lever that the product leaders at Google pull often. Why is that? Why does Google shut down so many products?
Yeah, so I've approached this differently as time has gone on, right? Which is my so Google Plus Games, I shut that down. It hurt a lot. I remember when Google Reader shut down. Like I don't know if people remember this. Like I was super upset. It was something that I used, every single day and all of that. So I think you understand it as first of all, sort of early on in your career, and you sort of it is upsetting. But I look at the flip side of that, which is I think about it in terms of two things: risk taking and opportunity cost, right? Which is I think you never want to be the fact that you're able to shut things down lets you start and experiment and try more things. On the other hand, if every decision we always made were like, okay, what is the maintenance cost of this in for eternity? I think you will try less things. And so that one is one thing to me. And the second thing over time I've learned is it matters obviously how you treat your users and how you transition them and what the implications are. And I think it's a little bit different with enterprise versus consumer products. Um, but I think a lot of it is opportunity cost, right? So, for example, I thought I was heartbroken shutting down Google Plus Games, but I knew that the future was mobile gaming, and we all sort of intellectually knew that like, oh, we should accelerate that as much as possible, and we have only so many people. So that was the right thing to do. And of course, you sort of, especially again, I was very early in my PM career there. So the argument I was making to everyone was like, yeah, we should do both. And like, nope, that's you've got to pick. And I think at some point, right, like you sort of need to make those calls. And so yeah, I think as long as you treat the people that are using your product well, you give them options, they're not surprised. To me, it is always sad when that shuts down, but it is also like I think to the point of like why does it shut down so many product? It's also like wait, it tried so many products and so many of them succeeded. Is also the sort of the way I look at it. Though again, if I know how I reacted when Reader shut down, so I don't blame people for being upset. It's very understandable.
Yeah, I think that really resonates actually with the career theme we were just talking about, which is like, what is the long-term goal? What
Yeah,
is the opportunity cost here of this bet we've made if we continue maintaining that bet? So now we're going to dive right into product strategy at its
let's do
core.
it.
You made the claim that product strategy is the core of what being a
Yep.
product manager is. And I think that's actually a spicier take than people might realize because a lot of PMs
Really?
are very focused on execution and delivery, and their CEOs are pretty much
Yeah.
dictating the product strategy. So, and strategy can also be a fuzzy term where different people
Yep.
interpret it differently. Some people, they write up the roadmap that the CEO gave them and then they put the title strategy on it, and that's the strategy document. So, what is strategy and why is it core to being a product manager?
Yeah. So there's a lot of writing on this. My favorite sort of pithy explanation is actually one of the first few things I read when I was becoming a product manager. So Adam Nash wrote this thing about sort of being a great product leader. And one of the things he defines there about strategy is it's quite simply defining what the game is that you're trying to win and defining how you will keep score. Right. So it's really like why these are the set of things we are going to do. If we do them, this we will win. And again, part of your job as a PM is defining success for the team. And this is how we know it's working. So defining the metrics that tell you if your strategy is working. So to me, that's sort of the simple core, right? Which is why are we doing what we're doing? Um, if we do this, winning can mean many things, right? But like we will win, and this is how we're going to keep track of it. I think that to me, like everything that else that you described, execution, roadmaps, all of that, they should flow from that, right? Like this is a situation we're in, this is what we're doing, and so now we're doing all of these things. And by the way, if all of these things that we're doing are working, you should see a metric or you should see a scorecard or a dashboard. You should see that working, and then that's the PM job. Um, yeah, so to me that is the core, and that is why I believe like strategy work is critical to it. Um, I think it's a fair comment that in some cases, especially startups, smaller companies, there are the strategy part, like the CEO may be the default product manager in some cases. But I think at some point, especially if your company's scared to any sort of small, reasonable size even, um, that person is unlikely to have the bandwidth for every part of the product or even a large product.
Makes sense. So, a lot of PMs, they're given the task of developing strategy. And as you've said,
Yep.
most of that strategy they develop and that we come across is shit. So, why is
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I said this was aware, and sort of was like I was surprised it it was controversial, right? Because I think to your point, exactly that people are given a task of developing a strategy, and they're told, by the way, it would be nice to have it next week. And so then what you get is generally you get two things. One is I think the first thing you described, which is here's my roadmap, that's my strategy. Or you get another thing which is more wishy-washy, which is, you know, we want to change, we want to save humanity. Like it is our mission to like empower every person to be a better human being. Like you get a mission statement or a value statement, which is not really distinguishable from like five other companies that may be doing the same thing. And you have no sense of like, okay, fine, this is great. So what are you doing? And how does this align? And so to me, that's the gap, right? So most of the documents, and by the way, there's a book by Richard Drummond, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. I remember reading that and then sort of going through a bunch of I sort of advise a bunch of startups. I talked to a bunch of people at other companies. I looked at a bunch of stuff at Google and I was like, oh yeah, everything he says that's wrong with strategy documents, like, yep, I'm seeing a bunch of it. And I think that's how you know, right? Which is, um, yeah, like I do think a lot of people, and I think again, it is people feel like they need a strategy, and people sometimes are pushed to develop something quickly. And so what you get is this, right? You get a rushed sort of diagnosis. And by the way, like even I've heard a lot of people say things like, "Oh yeah, in your first couple of weeks in a new job, you should have the strategy down." And I go like, I don't know. Like it takes a while. It takes a while to figure out what's going on. I think it's fine to say this is our plan right now, but I think getting to doing this will lead us to win actually takes a while sometimes.
That's always the task that's given, I feel,
Yeah.
from PMs I talk to. First 90 days, what's your strategy?
Yeah, no, I definitely so by the way, I'm guilty of this too, right? Which is but the way I've sort of said it is whenever I start a new job, I sort of try and write a 90-day plan and say like, hey, the first 30 days I'm going to figure out what's going on, meet these people, then sort of I put another thing for the next 60 days and the 90 days. And the end of the 90 days, I say some version of I don't sort of call it a strategy document, but I say like I will develop a opinion on what is happening and what I think should be done. But I think it takes a while, and sometimes those 90 days aren't enough. I do think um, I do have something at the end of 90 days that generally says, hey, this is what I think we should be doing. And then people start commenting on it and it gets refined. 90 days is reasonable, like I think. 2 weeks is generally for a product of any complexity, not.
+1. So,
Yeah.
what are the markers of a bad strategy? Maybe you can summarize. You mentioned Richard Rummel, good bad strategy,
Yeah.
bad strategy. I'll link that in the show notes for people.
Yep.
But if you can summarize that. And then I'm also interested in this claim you made in another talk that you can identify a bad strategy doc in a minute or two. So,
Yeah,
how do you do that?
if it's got way too many buzzwords, if it's not specific, if it doesn't describe the specific situation the product is in, I think then you sort of know it's a bad strategy document. And by the way, most people um, have trouble sort of reducing that, right? Because there's often this like really impressively written background section. There's this really impressively written like principles we believe, and then there's sometimes a market survey. There's a whole bunch of things that obscures the fact that there isn't a core diagnosis of like this is the issue, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we'll know if it's working or not. And it's not even specific on like, hey, this is a bet, we're sure. Like, it's not specific. So to me, a good strategy is specific and pointed. Um, yeah, I think that to me is sort of the marker. And when you don't find any of that, I think that's a marker that like, yep, this is words. This is not actual like specific content.
So, I'm hearing don't use an LLM to write your strategy document.
Definitely do not use your LLM. Though it's interesting, right? So when when ChatGPT first came out, I was like, "Hey, give me a strategy for all of these things." So a bunch of different products, stuff I'd worked on, stuff I knew about, and I think I made these like, "Hey, this kind of matches what a bunch of like APMs would give me like on day one," and I'd be like, if they did, I'd say like, "Oh, pretty good job." And I think the interesting thing is, a year has passed, and the reality is like the LLMs they're not bad. They give very specific advice on like do this thing, do this other thing, and it doesn't connect in the end. But like I was like, hey, it's not unreasonable. So yeah, like don't count out the LLMs on this. But yeah, try not to use it. Be specific.
Yeah. I personally have coached several people recently who have tried to plug in an outline into an LLM, and it just turned me
No.
off so much from the strategy
Wait, they
document.
actually they actually did that?
Yeah, I think that that's what they've gotten used to. That's their workflow. They create an outline, then they have the PRD. They just plug it into the LLM to like put all the window dressing on it. But I think for the strategy document, it
Oh.
just doesn't work.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think a lot of it also is, and this is, by the way, this is now a personal style thing. Uh, I like I like strategy documents to be short and specific. And again, you can tell an LLM to do that, but I think that that's not ideal. Huh,
Yeah.
interesting.
So another thing a lot of people do, in addition to using LLMs on their strategy documents, because it's just one of 100 things they have to do, is a lot of teams, they'll get the whole product team together, the PM, they'll get the designer together, they'll get the tech lead, and the first thing they'll do is they'll write down their principles. And
Hmm.
I know you recently railed that in one of your Substack posts. So tell me more about that. Should teams
Yeah.
start with principles?
If they have them and they aren't trying to do them on the fly. Yeah, so I got so I wrote something and I write my Substack post late at night just before I'm going to bed, which I now realize may not be a great idea. But I sort of wrote something on my Substack and posted on LinkedIn, and I got a bunch of comments like the next day, and even at work, people were like, "Hey, I read this thing. Like, what did you mean?" And I think if you're making up your principles as you're writing a specific product strategy or feature, I think what you're often doing is trying to justify the feature or the strategy from the and sort of backing your principles out of that. I think so. A long time ago, 12 years ago, I sort of helped write sort of the principles for YouTube when I worked there as chief of staff for the person that sort of ran the engine product orgs. And the reason I think those were easy to do is because it described behavior and beliefs that everyone had learned over a long amount of period of time. So I think if you all sit together and say, hey, we are going to write our principles. What are the things we actually believe that we've tested through our decisions over a long period of time? I think that makes a ton of sense. And I think if you reference those principles at the start of your document, I think that makes a ton of sense. But generally, I find most sort of PRDs or strategy documents are trying to address a very specific thing. And I think trying to sort of create principles on the fly, saying, hey, these are principles, so we're going to do this, is not helpful, right? So I think if you don't have principles already written down for your company, your product, um, then you shouldn't be trying to like manufacture them at the top of your strategy document or your PRD, which I've seen people try and do. And yeah, so I think that's the thing I believe. And some of those principles are just like motherhood and apple pie, like sort of be on the side of the user. Like yeah, like that's everyone's principles. What's different about yours? And I think that's the thing that sort of I was reading about, which is wait, why am I reading all these principles which are like not that useful?
It's the apple pie positions that are just really annoying. If you're
Yeah.
taking a controversial stance, like I believe YouTube said something along the lines of they really care about watch time, they really care about promoting creators and the creator economy. Those are taking a stand on something that's different than the other video platforms. So it's actually helping define the positioning in a sense. It seems to me like that's the takeaway here.
Yeah, I think it's that, and also I think the goal of principles should be to sort of give a decision-making framework to lots of people, right? So these are things that while, someone that may not be in the room is making a decision potentially like uh, years from now, if they sort of internalize this, it will help them make better decisions. So one of the things that stuck with me, you mentioned YouTube, like there was this genuine belief that there's no free pixels, right? So every pixel matters, and we're not going to sort of there's a cost to like taking up space, right? Um, and this was sort of ingrained in everyone, so nobody thought about, oh, I'm gonna like add my feature on top, uh, because it sort of just internalized people. No, no, that's not something we want to do. And I think this, but the reason it worked is the org acted in that way. And so I think that's really important. So having these things that you genuinely believe on, this is the way we want to build product, this is the way we want to behave, I think is really important.
So if you're writing the principles for your specific product functional area within YouTube, it probably doesn't make sense then to repeat sort of the high level
Yeah,
YouTube
those are a
product
given.
principles.
Yeah, yeah, those are a given. So I think the thing I always say, like, hey, maybe there's something different that you need to have. So sort of uh, when I was on search and we sort of ran, I was responsible for media queries on search. You sort of have a nuance on top of that, but you always start with the search things, right? Like sort of put the user first and all of that stuff. So I think all of that is a given.
So it sounds like principles is optional or maybe even probably not needed unless you have something different to say. So if
Yes.
we're just creating the Satyajeet style guide for a product strategy document, if you're helping somebody write down sort of the template subheaders for the areas
Ooh.
they need to fill in for a strategy document, what would it be?
So I'm going to be surprisingly non-prescriptive. So this is I always like sort of tell people I'm not a big fan of templates, even though sometimes in my job I have published templates for people just as a guide, saying like, hey, this is you could have a section that says background and core issues and like diagnosis and strategy. I don't believe that's necessary. I think a good strategy document, and again, not a PRD, not specifics, a good strategy document, um, generally should be presented to people that have a pretty good idea of the area that you're in, right? So you're not selling to execs yet. You're saying, this is what I want to do. And you're generally sort of presenting it to people that have an understanding of your area. So I think it can be really short. It can be a document. It can be 1 or 2 pages. So for the longest time, most teams that have had, like, we call it a strategy 1 pager, everyone takes 2 pages, and I go like, yeah, it's fine, it doesn't matter. There are definitely people that played with like font size and stuff to like shrink it, and I was like, no, you don't do that. But no, I think it's short and it says, this is what we're gonna do, and this is why this will work, and these are the core issues that we have right now. And I think that's about it. And you can write it in different ways. Um, you should have an understanding of your audience, right? So uh, I believe it's like I don't believe in sort of templates for this, but I think it should address that issue. I tend to like write a TLDR at the top of everything I write, and then I write the thing that I actually write. Um, I like that because I can sometimes. I'm someone who reads every document twice, right? So I'll read it the first time to understand what's going on, and then I'll read it again to see like, okay, what do I disagree with, agree with? But everyone has a different style. So some people I know just like will read every word, add comments. So you should understand that. But I sort of err on the side of brevity for these things. So the shorter you can make it, the more specific you can make it, the better. And if
And
you
when it
if you feel like you have to have a bunch of background information, just link it out.
or appendix, right?
Appendix, yeah.
That's what I always did personally. I had a 1 to 2 page
Ah,
document with like
and then you
four
have a
to
giant
five
appendix.
exhibits. Yeah.
Yeah, that works too. That works too.
So what is the best strategy document you've seen that you can share with us and what made it so great?
I can't share it with you. That's the downside, which is all the best strategy documents I've seen. I think there's like strategy documents for like companies and products, right? And so the best one, so I'll give you one that's public, right? So the one that has impressed me the most with its clarity that is public are there two Tesla letters that Elon wrote, which is super short. very specific, and like this is I think it was called the master plan or whatever, right? Which was, hey, this is what we're gonna do, and this is why it'll work. And I think the flip side is I've seen a couple internally that are much longer and very interlinked because it's a very large product area. But again, like they had this quality of being super specific for each part and saying like, this is what matters here, and this is why we're going to do this. Again, lots of internal teams I feel like do that well, but they all have this quality, which is they're non-fuzzy, they're very specific, they explain why what they're doing is important and why their fix will work.
Makes
Yeah.
sense. And one other section you mentioned in there was the issues you're having. What is
Yeah.
like a good issue versus a bad issue?
So, a good issue is sort of saying, hey, our challenge over here is we given where we are, distribution and sort of switching costs are going to be an issue. So this is the thing that we're going to do to address that. Our retention is falling at this rate, and we it can even be something as like we don't yet understand why, but our number one priority is to diagnose and fix this, because without it, our product falls apart, right? And so I think, and again, all the thing I should mention is, if it wasn't obvious, all strategy is at a point in time, right? So a good strategy is something that holds for a while, but it it is extremely understanding of the current state of the product as well as the market, right? So um, it is not unreasonable to, in fact, if you don't change your strategy or at some point in time, it is either a sign that you've got a bad strategy or you're not adjusting fast enough. I had this conversation once with someone that ran a pretty large product at another company, and he sort of told me what the strategy was, and I was like, "Wait, I thought that was a strategy like 6 years ago. You're still more or less in the same position in the market." And he's like, "Oh, I did not know that." And then he was new to that company. Um, it basically was like, "Hey, you're not. The strategy sounds fine, but it's not acknowledging the history of the product and where it came from." And again, like there's a flip side of that, which is if your strategy succeeds, you likely have a new problem that you then need to adjust to, right? Which is, you mentioned the YouTube watch time thing. It had to evolve. Like there was a new metric once, that was going well, and it had to evolve again once you had that going well. So I do think even if your strategy succeeds, you sort of then need to adjust the hill you're climbing. Um, and so that's something you've got to always be extremely aware of.
How do, let's say you're a mid-career product manager, how do you kind of
Yeah.
develop that sixth sense of your strategy has been in place too long or you're changing it too fast? How do you understand kind of what that Goldilocks zone is?
You can, um, honestly, like you should. In fact, it's probably easier for mid-career folks to figure that out than people at the top, right? Because you have your pulse on the product, and you understand how people are using it, right? So this notion of, I'll also mention like I feel, at least what I've observed over time is writing good strategy, developing good strategy is definitely a learned skill, but some people are better at it than others, and it's not level dependent, right? So one of the most strategic people that I've met when I met him was an APM on the team, um, and some of the best PM decisions that I've seen made are often by people early in their career, not constrained by sort of the way the org works. So one of the things, so the thing I'll say is it's sort of level independent is the first thing. So that's not it. But I think you sort of take a look at how people are using your product. You take a look at metrics and say, wait, is this continually is it should I just continue in the direction that I'm going? I do think, for example, if you change your strategy every 6 months, that's a problem, right? That means clearly you were wrong. You were wrong a couple of times. But I think this notion of once something is going well, saying, should this really be my focus right now? Or should that sort of be on its own and sort of move on? So I do, even frankly, even when we do internal planning at Google, and you highlight certain things, the things you highlight aren't necessarily sort of the core business metrics. It's sort of the change that you want to drive, right? So, hey, this is the change I want, which is why I'm highlighting this to everyone. So occasionally, I'll pick an OKR, and the team that is sort of doing the core work will be like, hey, we weren't the highlighted OKR. What's going on? And they're like, no, no, no. What you're doing is important, but it's not the change we want to drive this year. And so, which is why I'm sort of highlighting this particular key result because I want people to understand this is a change. I want to sort of really focus on this. And so, yeah, like I think that's another part of this thing.
This episode is brought to you by Adio, the next generation CRM. Imagine a world where your CRM is powerful, easily configured, and actually intuitive. Adio makes that a reality. As I've profiled in the Product Growth newsletter, setting up Adio takes less than a minute, and within seconds of syncing your email and calendar, you'll see your relationships in one place, enriched with valuable data, including things like relationship strength. Adio lets you build Zapier-style automations, create powerful reports, and works for any go-to-market motion, from PLG to sales-led. Adio is designed for the next era of companies like yours. And companies like yours shouldn't have to deal with inflexible, one-size-fits-all CRMs. Join industry leaders like 11 Labs, Replicate, and Modal. Head to adio.com/productgrowth and you'll get 15% off your first year. That's attio.com/productgrowth. Okay. An interesting question I once saw you ask an audience in a 60-minute masterclass on strategy was, what companies are good at strategy? So I have to ask the question to you.
I think and again, it's hard to know for sure from outside, right? But I've always sort of thought Netflix was pretty good, right? Which is in terms of how they think and push things, and sort of you can see it manifested in their product. You can also see when they get things wrong, they're not afraid to like, okay, we're changing things. I think at some point, like I admired the process at Amazon, right? Which is so I think I'm trying to remember when that masterclass was. I think when I said it, like I truly believe I liked the process, and more than that, I liked the thoughtfulness of writing stuff down, and then the perseverance to sort of see that strategy through and see like, hey, we're giving it enough time to see if it's working or not. Yeah, so those are, I'd say, in terms of large companies, sort of companies from externally that I've sort of seen that I've admired.
Peeling the layer back on each of those, let's start with Netflix. What are some of the things that you've kind of seen or you've noticed as an observer, as someone who's studying other people's strategy? Because a lot of people always ask me that, like, how should I be studying someone else's strategy? So what have you kind of studied and seen in Netflix?
So I think a couple of things. One is, so I'll give a shout out to Gibson Biddle. If you haven't he writes a lot about product. He does a bunch of these cases. And so he has certain stories and examples from Netflix. So, folks should look online. I think, again, the specificity of, I think, frankly, like, Reed Hastings was surprisingly prescient when he started about where all of this would go, and this would go online. And I think figuring out, okay, this is going to take a while, so we're going to start this DVD business, and we'll figure out how to transition it was very impressive. And I've also talked to people about the decision-making process to do originals that they had over there and how that they sort of went from experimentation to trying it. And I think that there's a certain sort of, okay, we're going to try this. This is how we're going to make it work. That I found over the years. And again, this is over, my snapshot is very long, so I'm sort of snapshotting the last 14, 15 years. I've just found that incredibly impressive. And I think if a company, and I can say this of many years, like sustains for that long, and you kind of see them making mostly good calls. No company gets it 100% right. In fact, it's a bug if you're getting it 100% right. But I feel like if you can consistently make those calls, and are I also mentioned Amazon, and what I've liked about Amazon is they make the calls and they're patient with a lot of these businesses, and because some of these play take a little bit longer to play out than others, and you sort of want to give it enough time to make sure you aren't pulling it too early, and I think that's sort of the key.
Very interesting. Can you say more about this idea that it might be a bug if you don't
Yeah,
sometimes make mistakes with your strategy? Is that because you're not ambitious enough?
that's exactly right. Which is I'll sort of microcosm it to sort of myself for there was a period of like a year or two where I felt like, hey, I was making a bunch of decisions and they were all sort of going product decisions and they were all sort of going pretty well. And I was mentioning this to a mentor, and he's like, "Okay, you're clearly not swinging enough," and that was right, which is everything we were launching was doing really, really well. But I sort of looking back saw that I'd become a little more risk averse. And you need to fix that sometimes, right? It means, and again, it's easier to do that on some products than others. Other products just sort of like the area I'm now, like everything is a swing for the fences. But I think you've got to be careful about that, right? So I think it is, especially when you're doing many things, I think it's okay. You should expect once in a while for things to not work out. Because again, sort of the risk of like not trying ambitious things is really, really huge. It sort of means you're on a different trajectory as a product. It means you're on a different trajectory as a company. And so I do think like, yeah, I do think like, sort of getting 100% is sort of a bug.
So is it better to have a strategy that's entirely off direction because you were so wildly having a bet? Or is it better to have a strategy that maybe 20, 30% was off direction?
So it's not, I mean, again, sort of, I wouldn't say it is, a strategy doesn't mean the thing needs to 100% work, right? So a strategy is saying, hey, we believe this is an area, this is the thing that we want to experiment with. We believe X, Y, and Z, right? But, it's possible that execution, market scenario, whatever, that thing does not work out, right? So it is, I think, I don't mean off direction. Like in an ideal world, like some amount of placing bets is part of your strategy, right? Which is, we think this is a market, we would like to make this work, and so we're going to invest in it. And then you come back a year later and say, oh, okay, like, this is what we need to adjust to work in this market. We need to invest more, we need to change our product, et cetera, et cetera. But you could come back a year later and say, actually, you know what? Like, we may not have the ability or the resources to win this. We're pulling back, right? So it is not the fact that you failed in that market, right, is not necessarily a sign of like bad strategy or a bad bet, right? So it was a strategy, it was a bet. For whatever reason, either execution on your part or sort of market realities or what it was, it didn't work. I don't think that's necessarily sort of saying, okay, I was completely off. And I just that from like, strategy being in a bad direction. I think strategy being in a bad direction is sort of more aimless, right? So you look at something and you can't explain exactly precisely what you were doing at the time beyond some notion of, oh, others were doing this too, and this person said it might be a good idea and it looked cool. Like, I think it's that. That to me is bad strategy, which is you're not able to explain why the actions are sort of being executed.
Makes sense. We keep coming back to this concept of bets. And at the very beginning, when
Mm-hmm.
we talked about it, you also mentioned a confidence level. So it sounds to me like all PMs should take away that your strategy, hopefully being updated something like yearly or at least reviewed yearly, should have some level of bets with certain confidences attached to them.
100%, right? Like I think especially in growth companies and innovative products, right? Like you are taking some amount of, you don't, everything is not scaling product market fit. You're trying to find product market fit in a lot of these things. And so you have to take some, like by definition, right? Like you want to take some amount of bets, and some of those bets will not work out. And again, I think you should also have a sense of, is this, to your point, confidence and sort of, you're very confident it'll work out and the payoff is small, or is it like you're not sure, but if it works out, it really, really works out. So I think you should have that as well, right? Like you don't want to take a low confidence, low return bet. You want to take a low confidence, extremely exponential return sort of bet. And so I think even understanding that as you're placing these bets is super important.
Got it. So high confidence, low return. The lower the return, the higher the return, the lower the acceptable confidence.
Uh, let's say the higher the return, yes, yes. As long, so I mean, obviously, high confidence, high return is great if you can get those, right? And obviously, if that's what you have, that's great. But what I've generally found is for the exponential returns, for the really high returns, you generally have you're betting on like a technical breakthrough or a user understanding breakthrough that is non-obvious. And so for those, I think you should be okay to like take those swings. Right? A better way to sort of understand it is like Google's had this 70-20-10 thing for a long time, which is you put 70% of your resources on the core sort of business to make sure it's growing, etc. You put the 20% on the thing that you think is coming next, and you sort of expect it to work, but it may not in some cases, but really you sort of expect to be the next big thing, and you have a reasonable amount of confidence. And you put 10% on the things that are absolutely nuts, right? Which is they are likely not to work out, but if they work out, the payoff is incredible. And I think the challenge is I think we don't place enough of those 10% bets, right? I think most products and companies, and sometimes it's for good reasons, right? It's resources, it's priorities, all of that. But to me, like I think those 10% bets are really important as well, even as
And
part of your overall strategy.
and sometimes you have to sunset those 10% bets.
Sometimes you have to dance those 10% bets by definition. Some of them will get sunset.
Is
By the way,
there
even the
a
20%.
is there a limit to the aperture or the applicability of 70-20-10? Is this going to be applicable to, let's say, an APM that is responsible for, I don't know, the information architecture of Gmail?
No, no, no. I think 70-20-10 is at an org level. Like each person is firmly in one of those projects. I don't think it's how you segment an individual person's time or even an individual team's time. I think at its best, it's, hey, you are on a 10% project or you are on a 70% project. Um, I think once you get to like managers and stuff, like yes, you have a portfolio, you have some of the things in that, but even that, like I think you should wait as to sort of push that as high as possible in the org.
So it's
I think at
really ideally
individual
the
level, still there.
CEOs, the VPs making most of those bets, then some the directors, and then very few
Yeah,
the
I would
group
say it's
product
about that.
managers.
About that. Yeah. Like as a manager, I think you should generally be on a project. Occasionally it's fine to sort of have one of those, but that should be the exception, not the rule.
Got it. And one of the words you used a couple questions ago was experiment. And I wanted to talk more
Hmm.
about that and specifically experimentation, because obviously this podcast and newsletter is product growth. We have a lot of growth product managers
Yep.
who tend to have more experimentation. They tend to have bets and strategies that change pretty quickly. Can you talk to me a little bit
Hmm.
more about that and if that's valid? First of all, that statement, and just generally kind of the role of experimentation in product strategy.
No, I think it's super important. So for some context, I worked on search for many years, which has a very sort of strong culture of experimentation, right? Which is it's easy to run experiments, like the experiment infrastructure is well developed, And so people often will sort of back intuition with experiments and say like, okay, this is, I was right, I was wrong, this is what's happening, etc. And so I think in terms of strategy, which is experimentation is a very quick way, and in general, you should find the quickest ways to validate or invalidate certain beliefs, right? So experimentation is a way to like quickly validate if the strategy idea that you have makes sense. Um, Especially if you have a product that's at scale, like you can run these small experiments to see how people feel about things. And you can have long-run experiments to see the long-term impact of your strategy, your product, etc. So no, I think experimentation is honestly a great tool to build the perfect products. And I think that's the way I sort of see experimentation. Is that sort of what you were asking or looking for?
Yeah, and taking it one layer deeper, so
Yeah.
we're talking about the bets and the confidence
Mm.
level and experimentation. It seems to me like you want to deploy experiments and smaller experiments against the things that you have lower confidence for in order to increase
Yes.
your confidence.
That is generally correct, right? Which is, I think, you want to use experiments to answer the hard product questions, right? Which is, do people care about this? And you want to find the cheapest way to get to that experiment, right? And sometimes it's a scaled experiment in the product. Sometimes it's generally, I'd say like focus groups and user research are not that sort of scalable. But like I think you want to sort of validate. You first want to validate your understanding of the area using experiments. I think it's a reasonable thing. So, for example, a lot of my friends that worked on social networks would tell me we can't run experiments on a segment of a population. We need a group to come online. So a lot of their experiments would be like, we'll launch this thing in this country because we need the network to be present. And which is why I think generally you sort of want to experiment on the smallest set and generally validate product market fit in that. Sometimes I think the scale of the product is such that you need to launch it completely to even see if like it works. There are very few products like that, but I think there are very few features like that. But I think for full products, you sometimes need to put it out in its complete form to start iterating on it. And I think that's where it becomes like internally. I think the challenge with experiments is you can't often tell people, hey, this is an experiment, we're not sure. Generally, the team working on it also does not treat it like an experiment. And so that is not always clear to people, right? And so I think that to me is the sort of balance you need to find. And what I mean by that is, let's say we come up with a strategy and we have this sense of like, this would be cool if it works. We think it's hugely important. We'll have this team work on this. Um, Sometimes even if you tell people, they don't completely grok that this is a bet. They think it's their job to make this product work no matter what. And I think sometimes that's necessary, right? Like that's how products sort of get out. But I think finding that balance is the tricky part, right? Which is, does the team understand that this is a bet in the portfolio, and do they treat it differently? And how do you adjust, right? So I think that's something, especially sort of leads need to sort of set expectations. And so generally, sort of with teams I work with, we're like, hey, this is important. It's the area and the users are important, not necessarily the specific implementation. And sort of you want people thinking in those terms fairly early on.
Makes sense. So we referenced a couple resources. I think the three I remember off the top of my head were Nash, Rummelt, and the Tesla letters. What are your
Mhm.
other favorite resources and places to go when you're thinking about strategy content?
Mm, I don't. I think those are probably the big ones, right? I feel like I learn a little bit just from reading online and sort of. I think sort of there are textbooks, right? So there's like sort of. I always miss his name. What is the seven? So there's Porter's forces, and then there's
Helmer,
like
the seven
Helmer. That's right.
powers. Yeah.
Yeah, I think these are all good frameworks. I think, frankly, the more frameworks you have, the better. You sort of apply them in each scenario. But I find ultimately it comes down to again how specific you can be, and the frameworks help you be comprehensive, right? They help you make sure that you haven't forgotten anything. But I think in terms of like distilling it down, I really like sort of the good strategy, bad strategy approach.
So, slightly adjacent to strategy, but always hand in hand for the life of a PM is your OKRs.
Yep,
So, it sounds like your OKRs should flow from your strategy. But can
that's
you
right.
tell a little bit more about the details of the implementation nitty gritty of how you do that successfully or badly?
Yeah, I think especially when it comes to engineering implementations, I think you want your OKRs to be stretch but realistic. So I think you want to say, okay, if we want this to happen, what is the fastest way to make this happen? And given that, assuming you do, let's say, quarterly OKRs, what can we get done in the next 3 months? And I think you want aggressive but reasonable estimates in each case, right? The worst case scenario I've seen is people that were on the hook for implementing something are surprised by the OKR, and they're like, "Wait, there's no way I can get that done in time." Or the other way around, like you have a bunch of padding, and honestly, you sort of go like, "No, no, no, that can be done a lot faster than that." And I've seen both things. And so I think you want teams to be aggressive, treat the OKRs in the right way, um, and yeah, I think that's the way they should flow. I think setting the OKRs, wording them well is really important. You don't want something fuzzy like launch this thing and like define this. You sort of want a number that ideally tells you the key result, really, sort of the objective and the key result. So you want a key result that is very measurable. I think there was a acronym at Google, right, which is you want OKRs to be smart, specific, measurable, and I forgot what the other ones, but I like the first two. Specific and measurable is a good way to think about those.
The next adjacent thing with an OKR is the metric.
Mm-hmm.
So, we talked a little bit about how at some point YouTube actually had a North Star metric and they've evolved
Yep.
that several times. Should most products and most product teams have a single metric?
I believe it's hugely clarifying if you can. Um, I don't think, by the way, like it doesn't mean there's only one metric that actually matters, right? Because I think there's enough complexity in most products that there's actually a few things that matter. However, I think if you can focus people, especially if your org is really large, on the metric that matters, you save a lot of discussion, right? So, for example, both on YouTube on search, there were certain metrics that you went like, wait, does this thing move this metric more, or does this other idea move this metric more? And then if the answer was obvious, it became pretty clear what you worked on. Now, to be clear, there's a lot of nuance underneath, right? Yes, there are other metrics that matter, implementation, all of that. And you want your leaders to understand that nuance. But sometimes the simplified North Star metric helps people sort of focus. And I think a lack of that sort of can lead to different people and different teams arguing for the thing that they like in some way. And so I like the clarity of North Star metric. I think most teams should aspire to have one, and then have guardrails and other metrics. But again, I think it's one of those things where it's useful to sort of publish that, but it's also equally important, especially for leads and PMs, to understand the nuance of like, yes, we're going to measure that thing, but all these other things also matter. And I think sort of that's the clarity that people should have. I think if you're blindly hitting a North Star metric, it often hides a lot of complexity.
So, if there's a word that summarizes strategy, it's clearly clarity. Now, let's move
Yep.
on to our next topic for the day, which is the history and future of product management. You started at Google a long time ago, and you've
Way
been
too
in
long
product
ago.
how have you seen the PM role change over time?
Yeah. It's evolved quite a bit. So most of my product management experiences at Google, and specifically over the last 16 years or so. Um, I think I think when I started, the role was a lot fuzzier, right? Which is, I would say that PMs were expected to do sort of a little bit of everything, and a lot of things that now get segmented somewhere between a UXR and a data scientist and a program manager. There, sometimes even like a BD person, like we're all sort of the PM. So I do think over time, I think the sort of, and by the way, there were other companies that I was interviewing at when I joined Google that had that sort of nuance and split already, right? Which is, um, I remember interviewing for project position at Microsoft at the time, and they already had this notion of slightly different PMs, which I think came to Google briefly a little bit later, this notion of a business PM. Um, but I think it's sort of, so to me, like, I think the role used to be a lot more sort of, you kind of did everything, which I still think is the ideal for the PM role. You want to be someone that has an acute understanding of everything required to make a product successful. And until someone can fill it, you can do all of those parts. And I think over time, what has happened is the role sort of, as Google as a company has grown, we expect more internal coordination from our PMs than I think was required in the past. And frankly, like the other roles have been filled in. So a lot of what we would expect, early career PMs to do was a lot of program management. Now, often a team already has a program manager. Um, we didn't understand UXR well for a long time. And so most teams didn't have researchers. And so now many teams do. So I think PMs are learning to sort of work with that function, which is good. And so yeah, I think all of that has changed over time, which I think means that sometimes PMs can be narrower earlier in their career than say they used to be 10, 15 years ago.
And it sounds like that might actually open up the space for PMs to work on strategy more if they're not doing program management and UXR.
It should. It should. And I think, one of the early mantras that I learned as a PM was like, if you can find someone to help you with something, you know, let them do it. Because the more free time you have, the deeper you can think and sort of, ultimately the PM superpower is empathy, right? Empathy for your users, empathy for others, like, and that informs like, hey, do I have this insight that leads me to like build the right product, have the right strategy, all of that stuff. And so more time to do that is always great. And so to me, that is like the key power. So that's absolutely true.
Yeah, looking back, I've noticed the same thing, and I feel like it's the best time ever to be an ICPM because you do have these other functions. Even we see design and tech leads taking a much more active role in
Yeah.
product decisions than we did a decade plus ago. So it sounds like as a PM, the takeaway is focus more on strategy and delegate, or not necessarily delegate, but allow people to help you where they are capable and specialized.
Yeah, I mean, and also I think one of the best lines I heard was, I think it was a friend of mine from Facebook told me this line, which is the job of the PM is to make sure there's a culture of product on the team, right? So it's not to, sort of my interpretation has been as a PM, you don't need to make all the decisions. You just need to make sure the best decision gets made. And I think understanding that, making sure you have the broadest perspective, can distill it to the stuff that matters, and hopefully there's more time for that now.
So that's where the role has come over, let's say, the last decade and a half. Where do you see it going over the next decade and a half?
Um, yeah, this is an area I'm pretty excited about, to be honest. You sort of mentioned, LLMs and people plugging into them now. Like, I actually think AI has the potential to significantly transform the way we do our jobs. Um, in fact, like, I- I'm surprised the change hasn't happened already, right? So in theory, right, I already see, there's PMs have different skill sets, but for many years at Google, I've seen PMs, being able to use AI to like come up with mocks and run experiments and all of that stuff. In theory, right, like someone that is product minded, I'd assume like the tools are almost in place that they can take an idea and get like a quick prototype and like have mocks, like they can sort of go soup to nuts much quickly, much faster, right? Even analysis, right? Like, the first thing that I sort of the first thing we should tell search PMs was like get really good at log analysis. Then at some point the tools got better and they got data science support so that each PM didn't need to be an expert. But now, like in theory, right, like the tools should exist so that I can tell my favorite LLM to do a bunch of analysis for me. I can sort of tell an LLM to go run a bunch of user research. I can tell another LLM to like, you know, I can say the words and it'll come up with mocks, and then another LLM to sort of build an engineering prototype. So in theory, like there's a lot more tools that you have at your disposal. Um, and if you'd asked me like 7 or 8 months ago, I'd have said like, yep, this is the year that'll happen. At least my understanding of the current tools is we're not there. So I think it'll take much longer. But I think directionally, what should happen is every PM should be a lot more empowered. And I think that's a pretty exciting place to be. And I think the thing that will now distinguish like great PMs is this notion of like how do I creatively integrate all of these things? How do I iterate really quickly? How do I apply all these tools that I have? And so I think it's going to be a really interesting era of PMing for the next few years.
So it sounds like PMs will become more efficient if they're able to
Yes.
use these AI tools. What's the implication for the ratio of product managers to designers and product managers to engineers?
I don't know. That's a tricky one, right? Which is, I can tell you the ratios changed, right? Which is, I think when I started, if we had a, sort of three PMs to a designer, it was considered like, oh yeah, this team's like reasonably resourced. And I was like, no, that's way, like, that's like, the designer's like way too spread, way too thin. I was like, 2:1 is enough. And this was what I believed, like, I'd say like 12, 13 years ago. I think my observation is it sort of depends on the product. It depends on sort of, how technical the product is, how consumer is it, whether it's a developer product. But for a lot of consumer products, I think now the sense I get is 1:1 is the ratio that, a lot of Google's going for. Um, I don't have a sense of how it'll evolve. But I think what we are seeing is just more integration, right? So most of the great designers that I know are doing things that a PM might also do. And so I think we're going to see this evolve over time. Engineering is sort of all over the place. There was one product that I was on for a while that literally had a 1:1 PM to end ratio, which was nuts. But that product sort of required it. But there are others that, you'll have hundreds of engineers for a single PM because that's the nature of the product. So I think that's very product specific. Um, it'll be interesting to see how it evolves over time.
Okay. So we talked a little bit about how AI will affect PM. How do you think AI will affect design and engineering?
I think it's the same. Design in particular, I think, honestly, it'll be hugely disruptive for all of these folks, right? So engineers already, I think, are starting to see, changes to efficiency, and you have tools that make you a lot faster at your job. Um, I'd say like sort of you already see we already seem to have PMs that are like using their LLMs to fill out their strategy documents and potentially do analysis and all of that. I haven't seen as much yet in design, at least from the designers that I work with. But I think those tools are coming, and I think again there's I get the sense that every sort of profession will get uplifted by AI in some way. The tools will come. Uh, the more creative people will start using those tools first, and eventually they'll come to everyone else. Um, so yeah, I think there's a huge transformation in how we do our work, and it's going to be extremely, like all sort of technology changes. I think it'll be extremely disruptive. I think smaller organizations will be more nimble and have more incentives to adopt those quickly, and I think it'll flow from there to like larger organizations, unless there's like just people super active about it. So that's sort of my belief.
So everyone will become more efficient. So it could be actually that the ratios stay somewhat similar.
They could be, yeah. I mean, this is a somewhat controversial opinion, but I think over time, some of these professions will start to merge, right? Which is I don't think it will be unusual to have someone that is the product thinker, like we made these professions up. We made, like, not a lot of these job titles didn't exist or in the form that they did. And I think it's completely possible we have new job titles and sort of just it's more common to be someone that does product and design, and it's more common to be someone that is the PM, but is also responsible for some engineering stuff. So I think it's possible over time that some of these will merge, but we'll see.
That's what I think as well, especially titles like product analytics, user
Yeah,
research, even program management. Some of these titles that potentially we picked out of product management, as you just described, over the last 15 years, we might see some more collapsing.
I think so. I think it's very possible. And I think again, like I think we'll see it at small companies first, just because it'll evolve naturally. And at some point, someone will have a word to describe what that person does, and yeah, it'll sort of go from there.
All right. So that's it. That's product strategy. That's the history and future of product management. Now we're
Awesome.
moving on to the lightning round.
All
So
right, let's
these
do
are the
it.
fun questions, the quick ones. What is your favorite hobby?
I enjoy playing pickup basketball. I play it on the weekends and occasionally during the week.
Oh my gosh. All my
I'm
kudos
very
to
bad
you.
at
My
it.
knees cannot handle that.
Yeah, I let's put it this way. I don't play it very well, but I do. I am very enthusiastic.
That's awesome. The best defender.
Yeah.
What's your favorite interview question?
I can tell you because I've retired it, but I used to ask people, let's talk about three areas that you think you're just excited about their technology or the consumer behavior. And then once they picked those and they talked about why, I'd pick one of them and say, all right, let's pick something that like you and I can just brainstorm on, and let's build a product in this space. And let's talk about how. Let's talk about how we'd market it. Let's talk about what metrics you'd use. So I do like a full deep dive on something that they were excited about, and generally you got a pretty good sense of the person from that discussion.
All right. That's like a mini product strategy case, it sounds like.
It was, yeah, yeah. It was strategy, implementation, go to market. Like you could sort of go through all of that pretty quickly.
All right. So we talked about strategy books, but just generally, what's your favorite product or growth book?
I won't give you a book, but I'll give you an article, which is Ben Horowitz wrote this thing called Good PM, Bad PM a long time ago. And for the first few years of my PM career, I tried to read it, every couple of months, just to remind myself, like, okay, this is the rhythm. This is what good looks like. This is what bad looks like. The slightly disappointing part to me was I think he came to give a talk at Google at some years later, and I asked a question about it, and he's like, "Oh yeah, that was a long time ago. I was a PM. I don't really remember that now anymore." I was like, "Darn it!" Like,
Yeah, I think it was like 30 years ago that he
it was a
wrote
long time
that.
ago. It's a very old write up, but I thought the specificity was great.
Yeah, I think it inspired like literally 30 years of PM content
Yeah,
creators since.
no, I think that's true.
You still see those tweets sometimes. Good PM, bad team PM. Shout out Sid
Yeah.
Aurora. What's if any a newsletter you've been reading?
I've been reading a lot about AI generally. I think Ethan Mollick's sort of one useful thing is one of my favorites, just because I think the newsletter, but also just a lot of his content in general, I find extremely helpful.
Shout
especially
out
when
to
I was like learning about the space.
Shout out to Ethan. He's a professor at Wharton where I did my MBA. I took 2 classes from him, took all his optional dinners and stuff. He's a
That
really
is
cool guy.
good
He's a
call. Yeah, no,
workaholic too.
I can believe it. Like the volume of stuff he puts out is kind of amazing.
Yeah, he literally tweets like 10 times a day.
Sounds right. Yeah.
What's something very few people know about you?
Um, that I think many people know that like I really like movies and TV. But I think not everyone knows like I took a summer to go to like USC summer film school and made a couple of short films.
Oh, very cool hobby. Don't judge my lighting.
Yeah.
What's a new product you've started using and enjoy?
Um, so I used Claude for the first time, I want to say about a month and a half ago, and I was surprised by how quickly it became my default LLM. Like I think it's really, really well done. There are all sorts of little things that they do that I've just found really impressive.
And it's a fun product to go deep on. They've released their system prompt. They were pretty open in general, Anthropic, so that's cool.
Yeah. No, yeah, I really like I really like the way that products come together. It's very impressive.
What product feature or product are you most proud of shipping?
Um, so soup to nuts, I'd say like YouTube live streaming a long time ago because it was sort of I was dropped on a team where uh, after I'd accepted the job, the person told me that offered me the job. They're like, "Hey, by the way, you should just know. I think there's a 50% chance you're going to tell us that we need to come and shut this down, but we trust you to tell us to do that." And I think going from what was essentially infrastructure to building a product that worked, that had a plan how it would make money, how it would scale, how it would get long adoption over a period of a year, I thought was especially at the stage of the career I was in, I was extremely proud of. I think sort of long term is probably search. It's the one that I worked on the longest, and touched many different parts of it. And so it's still, even though it's been a few years since I worked on Google search, it's probably the one that I'm most attached to.
What commonly held belief or saying do you disagree with?
I'm not a big fan of like fake it till you make it, which a lot of people say. I'm like, no, no, no. Like, hopefully, in a well-functioning environment, you can sort of say what you don't know, and still people will give you the time to like do it well. So yeah, fake it till you make it. I think has all sorts of negative implications if everyone does it.
Spicy.
Yeah.
What's one product failure that you learned from?
Um, I learned from all of them. Uh, I think you mentioned Google Plus Games early on, right? Which is, I learned a lot from sort of, I learned how to think about my work in the context of a company from there, right? Because if you looked at everything I did, I grew the product as fast as possible. People were super happy. Metrics were up and to the right. But it was not successful in the context of the overall sort of framing of Google Plus. And then it was time for me to like go think about what to do next and apply all of that to what eventually became Play Games, which was, a different success. But yeah, I learned a lot from how that went, how I felt, and how I managed the team. So I think that was probably my biggest learning in terms
Awesome.
of failures.
I like to end the serious questions on failure corner. So, where can
Yeah.
people find you online?
I'm on Twitter at Salgar. I'm on LinkedIn at Salgar. I think those are the best place. I have a Substack, coincidentally, salgar.substack.com. And yeah, that's where people can find me online.
And how can listeners help you?
Feedback on the things that I may put out online, but also things I'm working on or may have said. I think that to me, feedback and discussion is probably the most helpful thing people can do.
Said like a true PM. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here, Satyajit.
Thank you. This was a blast. I really enjoyed the chat.
Thank you so much for listening. If you found this valuable, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Also, please consider giving us a rating or leaving a review. as that really helps other listeners find out about the podcast. You can find all the past episodes or learn more about the show at product-growth.com. See you in the next episode.